Hi everyone, I'm Bob Bowman, Managing Editor of SupplyChainBrain, and I want to welcome you to this special webinar presentation on top risks to watch out for in 2019 for procurement, sourcing, or supply chain, presented by Resilinc and featuring IBM. A little bit of housekeeping before we go on. Just want to mention that at the end of the presentation, we will have a question and answer session. So at any time during the presentation, audience members are encouraged to submit their questions by clicking on the Q&A box or the question box in the lower left-hand corner of your screen, and we will take those questions at the end. Now we have two great speakers today for you. We're going to start out with John Bovitt. John is currently the head of marketing and business development at Resilinc. He has more than 30 years of experience as a technologist, strategist, and solution advisor at other firms such as KPMG, Ariba, Aravo, CVM Solutions, Salesforce.com, and Oracle. He has authored numerous articles and blogs on sourcing, procurement, supplier management, and supply chain risk. After John, we'll hear from Louis Ferretti. Lou is the project executive for developing and leading a host of risk and compliance programs across IBM's global supplier network, including environmental compliance, supply chain social responsibility, conflict minerals, sustainability, risk, and business continuity management. And with that, I want to toss it over to John. John Bovitt, take it away.
Hey, thanks, Bob, and thanks everyone for joining us today. We put together, I think, a really interesting and fact-filled agenda for you, and we'll talk through that for the next hour. As Bob mentioned, please feel free to give us any questions you may have, and we're happy to either answer them today or do it as a follow-up. And as part of the agenda, what we'll talk about are some of the learning objectives that we'll cover today, and some of the key takeaways that we had from our the 2018 Resilinc Event Watch Annual Report. I think you'll find that very interesting and fascinating. The focus of today is to talk about the top risks to watch out for this year. We're already seeing some significant trends, and we'll cover that. And then not only that, but we'll cover what can you do about them, what are some of the proactive things that you can do, and Lou will touch on the things that he's not only looking out for this year, but also some of the things and specific areas that he focuses in on as well. So I think, and then wrap up with a Q&A. So I think you'll find today's agenda very interesting. And in terms of specific learning objectives, as I mentioned, what we'll focus in on is, first is, what are some of the specific issues, risks, and events that we learned from our reports from last year? And obviously, the reason to kind of highlight and touch on those, not that we'll go into it in detail, that report is available to anyone. I'll cover that at the very end today. But so you can download it yourself. We also have a webinar on that topic. But I think it's very relevant to when you're talking about specific risks and what you can do about it. Looking at the recent past is also an important learning element for today. And also, because of that, we can then take that and focus in on what are some of the top risks that you need to deal with, not only today, things that happened last quarter, but then the rest of the year, and then even beyond. So I think you'll see some really interesting risk areas for you to keep top of mind. And then finally, Lou, I think, is really great at covering what are some of the leading practices and what are the things that you can take and focus in on. Once you identify the risks, what are some of the things that you can do from a proactive nature? So we'll cover those as well. And again, we only have an hour. We can't cover everything, so look for future topics and answer your questions. So as I mentioned, one of the things we wanted to cover today was what are some of the key takeaways. We really did learn quite a bit on the data that we gathered last year, and we documented in our report, again, link to follow. But if you take a look at it, you can really pull out some really key areas. So let me cover some of those. The first is that so what were some of the key risks or key event areas that we noticed from Resilinc's perspective from last year? Well, the first is that what some of the most common events that occurred some of it's not surprising. It kind of falls into two main groups. The first is that suppliers are constantly changing organizations. It could be that they get acquired or they divest of certain elements of their business, or get acquired. Could be a management change. Things are constantly in flux, and that was one of the big areas. And then also the other interesting one is, and this trend continues, and I'll highlight this in a little while, is factory fires and disruption. Specific elements of your supply chain that actually manufacture, goods are being constantly disrupted. And we saw that last year, and we see that again, and I'll touch on that a little bit more. And then the other thing that we took away from last year's report is that the regulatory changes grew at a really high rate. And I think that's probably no surprise to anyone, but if you look at the percentage of growth, these are definitely things that you want to track. So it grew 640% last year, and we're seeing still an increasing percentage again this year. And then from a sheer kind of volume of how many supply chain disruptions and events and news alerts happened last year, and how many of those actually required impact assessment. In other words, someone had to actually look at them and say that, was there an impact or not. And we saw roughly 35% of overall events cause some sort of impact to your supply chain. And that's a really high number, and I think it really stems to or leads you down the path of, any event, however it doesn't seem that important, can be impactful. So we always got to be mindful of these things. And then the other thing was that a lot of these sites that are potentially impacted from a risk perspective are in your sub-tiers. In other words, it's not your suppliers or their sites, it's their suppliers and their sites and so on. And we definitely saw that last year, where it was nearly 60,000 sub-tier and also first tier, but nearly 60,000 sites were potentially impacted. So it really does have a very wide impact. And then finally, another really interesting takeaway from our report last year was that of the manufacturing sites that we know had some form of impact last year, and there was 12,500 of them, only 12% of them had some sort of alternate site listed, which just leads us down the path of a lot of these sites, if they do take a hit or take some sort of disruption, don't always have a fallback plan, don't always are not ready to necessarily handle them. So this was, I think, a real wake-up call for us at Resilinc and our clients. So that's some of the key takeaways from our 2018 report. So let's press on a little bit more. So if I drill into that a little bit more and give you a little more insight, which again we won't cover in super detail today, but M&A activity was very large. I mentioned around factory fires or explosions or some sort of disruption related to those, but also regulatory change I mentioned, but also rounding out some of the top then goes into things like extreme weather. Obviously, extreme weather in some years is worse than others, but it's always bad. There's always some impact, and those are some of the key areas. And I'll touch on some of the ones we're really watching for this year as well. But labor strikes are still bad in other areas. So with that, why don't we cover some of the top risks to watch out for in 2019? Lou, I'll pass it to you.
Okay, thank you very much. So as most of you know, we live in a world that's filled with risk, political, social, economic, financial risk. The top bar there was a study done by the IBM Business Institute recently and talked about looking forward into the years that we're living in, the century, and that these were the six mega trends, and one of them was risk in everything that we do. So that's certainly a given and a proven. But even more interesting following up on this was the outcome at the Davos, the World Economic Forum discussion a month or two ago. And this appeared in Business Week or Bloomberg, and you'll see here that they broke it by risk by likelihood, by impact, and by trends. And you'll see that there's a pretty good thread here across that I've highlighted. Weather, environmental risk, climate change, and so forth showed up in each one of those boxes there. So I'll comment on more of this later, but we see weather, climatic events being the largest risk to the supply chain if you have a global supply chain around the world. There are other things, but that has become, at least from our vantage point of what we've seen, the largest risk of interrupting a supplier acquiring their parts and their things that they need to build something, as well as shipping and then getting it on to the destination where it's supposed to be assembled. And that's on the production side. But even on the indirect side, where there might be service suppliers around the world, extreme weather has disrupted their services also. So it's not just something that is being made, but it's also services that are being provided. Okay, I'm going to go to the next slide. This is the world that many of us live in. I mean, those are real things that do happen. Some of them are long-term risks, some are medium-term risks, some are very short-term risks that they happen. I'll just call out, for instance, on the upper left-hand side, there's a periodic table and raw materials, but it's rare earth metals. So some years ago, as you might know, there's 17 rare earth metals. Some are light, some are heavy rare earth metals, and they're in everything. They're in all the computer parts, all the chips, and glass, in defense, in energy-efficient products and so forth. And while China had the capital on this, that they had most of the supply in their country, there is, by the way, I know you folks are probably thinking about this, Afghanistan has the second biggest supply, but no one's running to develop the product there in Afghanistan. So this was a longer-term threat because they were not releasing them and the prices were going up. It has subsided somewhat now because of a WTO case, but that's a longer-term risk that could come back. It has driven some degree of substitution, but it's out there. The lower one there on the left, I'll just pick out a few, on human rights. You might recognize that as a tin tungsten tantalum mine in the Democratic Republic of Congo, where the gentleman there has an AK-47 trained on some young workers to keep them motivated. These egregious human rights issues have plagued that country and really the supply chain for years. So that's a significant risk that if it's not being managed and worked on, as well as filing with the SEC. Cybersecurity to the next of it is probably the biggest risk that we collectively in the supply chain are facing. In fact, a good portion of the cyber hacking has come through suppliers. The study has shown. So it wasn't necessarily the supplier itself, but it might have been a supplier or a service provider to that supplier, which they use them as a sort of a conduit to get information, etc. So that is the number one, when I'm attending conferences and speaking, that is the number one risk that we see today. The financial risk is large as companies are pressed for more growth and more bottom line performance. They might take risks, so looking at the supplier financial risk assessment is critical, and to monitor that very, very carefully, especially if there's a single or sole source situation there. And the other things here, I'm going to go to the top there on environmental. The environmental laws around the world continue to get more stringent, more strict. There's more of them. They're more complicated, and they're more difficult to comply with. And it applies obviously to automotive, electronics, apparel, anything that's using substances that are banned or prohibited or have to be reported to a small degree. So all these things are affecting the supply chain. They come in different dimensions. They apply to different products, but it makes it a very challenging situation for procurement to do sourcing, for suppliers to maintain their supply of goods and services, and for the client to buy these things, assemble them, and get them on time without any type of interruption. John, I'm going to turn this back to you.
Oh, thanks, Lou. So what we wanted to cover too is what are the things that we're from a Resilinc perspective, and what are we closely watching? I think these themes they stuck from the last few years, but they're increasing this year. And I think one that when we actually recently did some significant work on, and also did another webinar, educational webinar on, was shortage and supply chain capacity issues. So that seems to be a really big theme this year. It was a lot. We saw a lot of interest relative to other things, and And so that's a really big one that we're watching. I mentioned earlier regulatory changes, that it's still growing this year. There seems to be no slowing down. I'll cover a little bit on that. Both Lou and I agree on these areas, including cyber threats. And I'll touch on some of the metrics that we can actually see from our vantage point on cyber, and I think it really does become very alarming. And then also, the same is true on factory fires and disruptions. So I'll cover that. Those are some of the key big areas that we're watching. From a shortages perspective, this is really interesting, and I think this is an area that I don't think is sparing any industry or any client. I think there's, whether it's the global economy, whether it's unemployment, can't find workers, or the shipping and trucker shortage, there's just the shortages and the supply challenges there that are being caused. It's hitting and impacting everybody. And you can, whether you look at auto, high tech, healthcare, life sciences, it really is sparing no one. And we'll touch on, like I said, we did a specific webinar and talked about this in a focus session as well, but it's a very interesting phenomenon. I think that's we've hit sort of an inflection point now where all of these factors from the, as I mentioned, the unemployment, the economy, and shortages of truckers and other things are all sort of colliding now and causing shortages across the board. And well, where are they coming from? Well, they're coming from lots of different areas, and I think one of the main, one of the main areas is that, you know, if you think about capacity, it's really a finite resource. So if you're grabbing capacity or your competitors are grabbing capacity, everyone's fighting for it, and when there's a shortage, everyone's trying to lock down what they can. And if you look at sort of the areas that are impacting this, it could be, you know, the trade wars and the regulatory changes that I touched on. It could be Brexit, which still remains for years. It's still been a hot topic and remains an open item. It could be some of the immigration challenges or emigration challenges. It could be on the commodity level, as Lou had mentioned, some of the rare earth metal potential shortages and challenges to procure that. It could be production delays caused by different areas, a skill set, an aging population. All of these things are driving and impacting this shortage and the supply capacity issue. From a regulatory change, again, this is another area that's sort of impacting everyone. I've talked to recently customers that are in, you know, consumer packaged goods and food manufacturing, and it's impacted them last year and going into this year. And if you look at China, Indonesia, and India and others are starting to really focus in on, for whether it's political reasons or other various drivers, they're really looking to impose anti-dumping legislation, and pollution controls, other things. And it's really driving, there's one headline here that's Brexit's causing drug shortages. And so there's lots of different factors, but you can, and literally I ran this sort of just a news search on some of the headlines, and everything pops up. There's so many changes going on. So this is, from a metric perspective, we've seen already 46, from a global perspective, 46 events that have caused some changes this year in regulatory. So it's still a really hot topic this year and something to really watch out for. From a cyber threats are, what's interesting to me from a cyber perspective. So again, Resilinc has a unique position in that we're constantly monitoring all the different threats that are out there. And so so far this year in Q1 only, was 9 cyber-related events, call it alerts. And what was interesting to me is not only are they increasing in frequency, but they're causing production outages. I think the cyber criminals themselves are getting more sophisticated, the technology improves, and as Lou even alluded to, and we see the same, it gets deeper. It might not be your suppliers that are the problem. It could be their suppliers and farther down the chain, and that ultimately boils up and becomes your problem. So it's definitely something to keep an eye on, and I think it's top of mind for, I think, anybody in kind of sourcing, procurement, and supply chain. And already, from our metric perspective, cyber is looking to be probably one of the fastest growing threats out there. And it set a record for the number already in Q1, so definitely be mindful of that. And as I mentioned, it never ceases to amaze me that factory fires and related, those types of disruptions are just a constant threat. And nearly, in fact, I checked before we went on today, and it topped 200. So there's been 200 factory fires in 2019 already. So the question for you is not if one of your suppliers and their capability to manufacture will be impacted by a factory fire, but it's just when. So, it behooves everybody to really be prepared for this particular area, because it's just a constant, it seems like every day I'm reading more and more about, sometimes multiple times a day. And this year so far, what we've observed is that China, India, Mexico, Australia, and the U.S. have all had factory fires. So it's not isolated to just one particular geography. Again, it's these things can happen anywhere and basically anytime. And the other thing to keep to note around factory fires, when we look at the data and where they're occurring, they're often happening in beyond your tier 1 suppliers. In other words, not your supplier sites, but their suppliers. So this is another one that can get buried in the multi-tier supply chain and thus still impact you down the line. So why don't we transition to, okay, now that we understand what are some of these top risk areas that we've covered, what are some of the specific things that you can do and we all can do this year and moving into even planning for next year as well? Lou, why don't I turn it back to you?
Okay, very good. Thank you. So many times a company might have a specific view of what they consider supplier or supply chain risk. As I deal not only internal to IBM but with our clients, each one's view of risk is somewhat different of what they're looking for. Sometimes it's controls, sometimes it's financial, sometimes it's regulatory that dominates. So I really wanted to cover here that if you want to be prepared, you probably need to look at this in three elements. One, what are your procurement business controls around your suppliers as far as onboarding and so forth and vetting them and that type of thing, as well as some type of financial controls. So I'm just going to show you two slides here. I won't go into it in depth, but I'm sure this is not unique to IBM, but many companies would have this at this time if they have a sophisticated procurement organization. Defining of policy and practices, what's acceptable, what's not acceptable in sourcing or the way a supplier is dealt with. That's box one there. And then training as far as what the buyers need to do so that they can understand their roles and responsibilities that go beyond just mere sourcing and bringing on a supplier, but they're often the ones that have to implement many of the risk and other type programs with the supplier. They need to be the face of this to the one that they're awarding business to. Having a common process certainly helps across an organization. That's way it takes away any fiefdoms. It makes things easier to do, easier to execute, and so on. A management system around this as far as plans, controls, doing internal checks as far as separation of duties, Sarbanes-Oxley, all those things are a matter of risk in the supply chain, but it starts really with the buyer's opportunity to engage in sourcing. And then it doesn't stop with just that it's done once, but you'll see there that many of these elements are continuous. They might be done yearly or within the year periodically. On the next slide there, I wanted to talk about more of the type of things that one does to protect the company and the suppliers. You might want to make sure that you're not dealing with embargoed countries. So there are many that are on the list of the U.S. There's certainly several more that have been put on since Trump has put the embargo on Russia back in May of 2018. So if you're dealing with any of the conflict minerals and the Dodd-Frank Act and filing, you'll be well aware of not having any type of those violations that the OFAC, the Office of Foreign Asset Control, might be looking at. And then what do you do as far as suppliers meeting terms or conditions? And when would you terminate suppliers? When could you give them a reprieve? All these things are rolled in. Supplier onboarding. I'll talk a little bit about that more later. That's a big screen, as we need to do a look to see if they're on a denied party list, the embargoed list, unapproved source list. We look for adverse media searches on the company, the board of directors, the officials, and any type of association to money laundering or corrupt practices. Now, that's a big screen. That doesn't prevent something from happening later, but at least at the start, you're not allowing someone to come into the fold that has any of these conditions associated with them. And it's also an opportunity to screen them as far as are they meeting environmental requirements? Are they meeting supply chain and social responsibility requirements? Are they meeting conflict mineral requirements? And those things right off the start. Also, when a supplier comes on, we need to do a baseline risk assessment, a business continuity assessment, a financial assessment, so that we're not surprised later on that we've taken on a supplier that might have a wonderful product but is does not have enough of a management system to keep themselves going. So this slide here on risk management system overview, it's broken into the types of risk, and I'm sure that there's many other types of categories one could call out, but we've defined this under supply continuity, legal and regulatory, reputation, and IT security. Now, as you'll see when I go forward, a risk might have two dimensions or even three dimensions here. It might not just be supply continuity, but it also might have other aspects of this. But one needs to develop this 360-degree view of risk, that the risk, again, are short-term, longer-term, medium-term, and often when you're sourcing in a globalization, the risks are cumulative, and the risks are probably very, very different than if you were doing something locally. And one needs to be aware of what these could be and have mitigation strategies in place. But even before you have mitigation strategies in place, to be able to detect that there is a risk out there so that you can prepare for it. And on the right-hand side there, the mention is made of you need tools and processes, subject matter experts. Well, you might do things with cognition or AI or that type of thing. You still need some people that understand the supply chain and have some type of historical view of the types of things that have happened, can happen, and things that were done in the past to mitigate. When I say they're corporate organizational guidance, many times there are tools or policies that help provide the structure by which we operate in, specifically for environmental compliance, so what the laws are, what the company's position on how we're going to execute against those laws, that's key. And then data analytics and that type of thing, knowing the data, having the data is key to having insight into potential risks and monitoring them. And that's one of the things that Resilinc does very well, that we enjoy, is some of their programs that give us great insight into the supply chain and even beyond the first tier. Let me just go in. I'm going to show you some elements. This is not the be-all or end-all of each one of these topics, but on supply continuity. And while that might be, people think in terms of hardware, it also applies to services. But here we look at having a supplier risk assessment program, and we look at the financial health of the supplier. The location, are they in a high-risk country? We could look at the corruption perception index and look at where the countries lay out there. Certain regions of the world are considered higher risk than others for various reasons. What's the recovery time if there was a disaster? Does the supplier have an alternate site, an alternate location? Do they have resiliency planning or a business continuity plan that will keep their business going? Not just for us, but their entire enterprise. We want them to stay in business not only for ourselves, but for the rest of their clients so they can continue providing their goods and services for us. And then a focus on sourcing. One might wonder, why would anybody ever engage in single or sole sourcing? Well, sometimes one has to. Maybe there's unique technology, it's unique in the industry, and that gives a competitive advantage. So knowing that that's what you want, you also have to know what the risk is, and what would you do to mitigate that should there be some difficulty with that supplier or supply line. Looking at the second tier, as John was talking about, is key because the first tier might look fine, and the first tier might even not know that there's a problem until they've dealt with the second tier. So having increased visibility in the supply chain is critical. Some of the things that can be done is having clauses in place as far as in the contracts of business continuity, recognizing that the supplier, they own the ability to provide their goods and services, but they need to have a view of what problems could they face. We don't have to worry about landslides necessarily in Manhattan, but you might want to worry about landslides in Indonesia or Malaysia or something like that. So each one of these business continuity plans that a supplier might have has to be unique to their location. We also do a business continuity assessment. Now, we're not in a position where we're going to tell a supplier, you need to have this, this, and this, because we don't want to define their business continuity plan. We will give them characterization of what we're looking for in it and what we have ourselves without being overly prescriptive. And we actually assess a supplier's business continuity plan at an enterprise level to ensure that they have at least the minimum acceptable controls and management systems in place that we would consider necessary to do business with us. And we schedule some deep dives. Having a survey, which Resilinc does execute for us, is the first step, but a survey is not the be-all, end-all. That going deeper and really examining the documentations, the results, the reporting, the findings, that would give one confidence that if a supplier does say that they have a business continuity approach in place, that they can demonstrate the associated evidence. One of the things I want to mention at the bottom there, which says tools and analytics, probably one of the most beneficial things we get from Resilinc is their event watch. We want to know, as you might also, anything around the world that would interrupt a supplier or the supply chain. Could it be a coup, weather, financial, whatever it is, we want to know it, and we want to know it. We have a little joke internally. We want to know it before it's going to happen. That way we can take a preemptive action from our playbook of how to prepare for any type of disruption or shortages should that be on the horizon. So we get these daily event watch, obviously multiple times a day, that gives us great insight into things that are developing. And then should they actually develop during the day or during the week, there's different levels of these that focus in on our specific suppliers, either at a first tier or a second tier level. So from there we can do some what-if planning as far as if the storm is on a path larger than we think, or if it takes a turn in another direction, does it engulf other suppliers? And we can do this over a time period as far as what would it look like today, in a few days, a week, and so forth, and do this type of scenario planning. Legal and regulatory compliance. Nobody wants to pay fines or penalties, but it also, has a reputational component here. So each one of us that are making hardware parts are subject to product safety, environmental, electromagnetic compatibility, telecommunications, and certainly environmental requirements. The EU, while they might be difficult, they're more uniform than other countries and geographies. Many of you are familiar with RoHS, Restriction of Hazardous Substances, REACH, and the hundreds of countries that we do business in have their own legislation. So there's little harmonization. There might be various countries that have a RoHS law, but they have some similarity to maybe EU, but they're different, which causes an extra degree of work, vigilance, monitoring, and planning and implementation. Besides that, there's a great focus on chemicals that are not to be used in electronic, automobile, and apparels, batteries. No country wants battery waste in their supply chain, from coin cell to lead acid. So most things have batteries in it, and there has to be a very comprehensive program of dealing with this. Power and energy usage. Many countries are attempting to define reduced power for equipment. We need to be able to either meet or stay ahead of this situation. Recycling. If you sell something in a country, you need to be able to have a collection point and demonstrate that you're able to take that back and recycle. All these things are often not thought about by those that are designing and putting products on the market. They're pretty excited as far as the new shiny thing that they're delivering there with the speeds and feeds. But this is all the kind of the ugly underbelly that has to be done to support products that are put on the market. Beyond those regulatory laws is GDPR. I know that we're all facing that. That came through last May. What was it? The fine was up to 4% of annual revenue if it was detected that somebody was in violation. So that probably gave a crash course to most companies that would do business with Europe. And we actually have, like you, a follow-up to do assessments, surveys, deep dives, so that should we get called upon to demonstrate our compliance by the authorities, that we'll be able to do that. And I said before, under mitigation strategies, it starts with onboarding. You want to screen out a player that's not appropriate, as opposed to letting them in, doing business with them, and then discovering that they're violating or not compliant with one or more of these elements here. I'm moving on to legal and regulatory. So as you'll see that there's some overlap here. If you're dealing with import or export, the right classification of suppliers according to the U.S. export control is critical, the harmonized tariff schedule and so forth. If you don't do these things right, there could be fines, penalties, damage to reputation, as well as your client not getting the product that they want. So it could impact your reputation as well as your revenue. So these things are critical that need to be considered in the big picture of managing risk. Government-owned entities, any supplier that's doing business with any form of government has to go through an additional education that's done periodically, redone, to make sure that they understand the controls that need to be put in place. And we need to demonstrate this internally to our board of directors that we have this in place. And this education, as you see here, is mandatory, and we need to keep monitoring it and recording this. Certainly, one of the things that are featured here is the Foreign Corruption Practice Act. No one wants to be in violation of that and called out and publicly exposed, and then the fines and penalties. It's very, very damaging to one's reputation, as well as it could affect their revenue, their stock. One needs to demonstrate that they have controls in place to run their business ethically and be able to meet these challenges. The Customs Trade Partnership Against Terrorism, they call this a voluntary program. The U.S. has one, Canada, Europe, and so forth. It's voluntary, but it's very useful, because if you're not doing this voluntarily, your shipments can be probably detained illegally at border crossings and so forth. So we found it very, very useful to demonstrate advanced compliance to this type of thing. On the reputation, when you think of it, it takes years and years and years to develop a reputation. It could take 1 hour, 1 minute, one event to ruin that reputation and not get it back for years, if ever. So companies need to be able to monitor unethical behavior, especially in today's world with the great transparency. The world views suppliers as the extension of a company. So the suppliers that one chooses, no longer can they say, well, they're a vendor and we don't know who they are. We're just getting product from them. They're really part of the company's characteristic of their ethics, and therefore setting standards for suppliers as far as meeting requirements, more than even just the minimum government requirements, but ethical requirements is key here. Even other risks there as far as reputation, the degree of fraud that can occur within a company or cyber of invoices and not paying either the wrong amount or for the wrong thing is. I'm going to stop this for the moment. It looks like there's some construction here. Okay, so we actually have a way of looking at invoices every night. There's a type of artificial intelligence that looks at and it compares about 40 different parameters, and if there's anything that doesn't match, that gets pulled out and doesn't get paid and gets pulled out for further examination. So that's another thing that keeps us focused on any type of risk that can occur and any type of reputational damage. One of the things that we do here, as I said on the onboarding, is adverse media, the financial assessment, embargoed countries. This is the time to catch them. And this is the time to have a very strong process in place, a management system that would allow you to have this type of visibility and then act quickly. Now, other programs that one would have in place is a strong supplier ethics program. So we use the Responsible Business Alliance, the RBA, which was formerly the EICC. We're one of the founding members of that. Today, there's about 160 companies there. We use their code of conduct. We ask our suppliers to demonstrate that they will comply with this. We actually do audits through third-party audit companies through RBA, and this is a very, very strong reputational badge that we have that our clients ask for, our investors ask for, and even governments have asked for. So we've been able to demonstrate this over the last 10 years or so that we have a very, very strong program. Now, even if a supplier is not meeting all the requirements initially, if they're going to continue to do business with us, they need to demonstrate full compliance to the RBA Code of Conduct. Also, an interesting thing here we have is supplier ombudsman. So this is where if there's something going on that's unethical or the supplier feels uncomfortable in the way that they're being dealt with, they have an opportunity to voice their concern to a protected neutral party that reports to our top executives, and that we would investigate that. Also, due to the cybersecurity, we have a program in place where we're assessing, I'm going to talk about that more in a minute, we're assessing suppliers' cybersecurity readiness, but also our internal affairs and business controls organization is looking at our suppliers and doing cybersecurity audits. So this is a new thing that we're doing for 2019, and we're looking at the ones that we think that have the highest risk in the sense of that they have the most sensitive data that if it was leaked, it would cause a problem to ourselves and others. Now, I'm going to go on to the next page on reputation post-engagement, meaning that they're already a supplier. In addition to complying with the EICC or the RBA now, Code of Conduct, we also have a management system called our Social and Environmental Management System, where we require suppliers to meet 8 requirements. But in essence, we want them to have a management system that governs their social and environmental intersects. And there's several things we want them to do, but it could be summarized into we want them to collect information, have goals of reduction for CO2, greenhouse gases, for energy, and recycling. And they could have more, but at a minimum, we want to see that a supplier has this. And then take these requirements and pass them along to their next tier supplier. This has been in place for many years. We actually have a manual on this, the program that is both governs us internally and externally, and yearly, that's what that award there is, that we get a external audit from Bureau Veritas on our compliance to the ISO 14001 standard. Again, clients, NGOs, our investors, they're looking for this type of fidelity across our business as an enterprise of how we're managing our supplier and supply chain business. For those of you who are dealing with conflict minerals, you know that the filing's coming up with the SEC at the end of May. Even though the government has instructed the SEC not to enforce it, they haven't removed the requirement of the filing. So each year, companies, there's about 1,200 in the U.S., do their filing and demonstrate their due diligence and make a statement as to where they are as far as being conflict-free or not, and what their actions are. So this is a huge, as you might know, a human rights issue. Egregious things are going on there. And from all input, it seems like this has, while it's a tremendous piece of work, is making a difference in what's going on in the Democratic Republic of Congo. And while this was focused on, the Dodd-Frank bill is focusing on tin, tungsten, tantalum, and gold. As you might know, the Democratic Republic of Congo is the main producer of cobalt. 67% of the world's cobalt comes from the DRC, and cobalt is a key ingredient in the electronic batteries, lithium-ion batteries that electronic vehicles will be using. So there will be even more focus on the ethical mining, specifically in the Democratic Republic of Congo, coming up. The next one here is on cybersecurity. It seems like the bad guys move faster than the good guys. So if you think you've solved the problem, somebody else is working on a new problem for each one of us. I was at a conference recently where a consultant said that on average, when there's a cybersecurity break-in, the bad guys have been in your data for about 250 days. So it's like somebody being in your house looking at where your jewelry, your silverware, all your valuables are, and the only time you know that they were there is when they left with what they wanted. And that's a pretty unsettling thought. So having programs in place to detect, prevent, and be alert to these things are key. I know that there was a government official that said it's not a question of if you're hacked, it's when you're hacked or how many times. So this is so prevalent, and it can really threaten the fabric of any organization that tremendous effort needs to be put on this internally to each organization, but specifically when dealing with suppliers and the passing of data and the electronic means of communication. All these, if not properly addressed, open up conduits of an opportunity to be hacked. I think John talked about ransomware. I mean, ransomware is so insidious that the first one I saw a couple of years ago was a hospital in California, and they just told the patients they couldn't be released or they weren't going to get billed. And the reason was that the computers were held hostage. But I think the interesting thing here was that the ransom was only asked for in, I don't know, $40 or $50, $60,000. So it's like the Somali pirates. They don't ask for a lot of money. They know they have to ask for just enough that somebody will pay them and keep the ships moving with the oil as opposed to being detained. So many times the cybersecurity ransom is not a huge amount of money. And in this case, it was asked to be paid in bitcoins so that it had some degree of anonymity associated with it. So as I've said here before, this is among all things, even beyond weather and climate and environmental issues, the biggest threat to businesses and specifically the supply chain that we see today. Now, in my summary here, and this is not, there's much more than I've actually been able to share with you, but if you have a program in place, you might have these very elements, or you're thinking about increasing the strength of your program or starting one. This is too difficult to happen without strong executive focus and support. It's not going to happen from the bottom up. And having integrated programs so that they're not standalone, but they talk to one another, and you could see a bad actor who is a bad actor in one place is often a bad actor in another place. A well-defined management system is not just a group of processes, but it will allow you to review metrics, results, take action, and then having tools and a budget for these things, analytics process, and as I said before, subject matter experts. That we don't have to have an army of them. We have to have just enough that can run a program after being well-defined effectively. Okay, John, I'm going to turn this over to you.
Thanks, Lou. Really interesting, and I appreciate you taking the time today to help educate everybody, and really appreciate the vast amount of global experience and practicality that you bring to the discussion. So hopefully everyone enjoyed that. One of the things that I wanted to wrap up today with before we go into the Q&A is just as a reminder. You don't have to. I think we're harping on a lot of the risks. We've covered what you can do about them, and then when you drill into it even further, there are lots of existing tools, processes, technology, help that's there available to help get you going. So don't feel like you have to reinvent the wheel. I think a lot of these things now there's existing technology and processes and capabilities to help you, and that's what I wanted just to cover a little bit today. And obviously Resilinc is a solution provider. We do cover lots of technology, data, and services around addressing the things that we did highlight today. Just to name a few on kind of the supplier mapping, as Lou had mentioned and alluded to, I think one of the real value drivers that we help IBM and other clients is understanding that multi-tier supply chain, who's connected to who and how, and being able to get that linkage of what you buy through that supply chain. And then being able to calculate risk associated with that, and then also monitoring. So as Lou had alluded to, being able to leverage what we call Event Watch, which is our product and service around monitoring anything that can impact your supply chain, whether it's a natural disaster, man-made disaster, as we talked about, or cyber threat or whatever, and then be able to, how does that actually impact your supply chain? And then all of this being able to also look at, whether it's from a benchmarking perspective or some of the metrics that I was able to bring today, came directly from our database in terms of being able to put all that forward. And being able to offer it in such a way that we do actually run on the IBM cloud. So just a little, I think we are a very secure, very highly available product, and also very open. So being able to plug into different systems, because this, a lot with risk, as we've talked through, needs to be an integrated solution. And I mentioned, actually we mentioned Event Watch, but just to let you know that is a global service that can literally let you know anything that can happen to your supply chain. It not only just tells you that these things are occurring, but where it's impactful. We monitor, 53 languages, lots of different, perspectives on it. We have risk experts that actually triage these things to make sure that they're very applicable, and then also provide relevance. So if it's impacting your supplier or one of their sites or one of their sub-tiers, how it impacts you, and product, commodity, and so forth. So lots of different dimensions to it, but I think a very valuable and easy to deploy service. So hopefully some of you will take advantage of that. So with that, Bob, why don't I turn it back to you and see if we have any questions through this 54 minutes that we've had so far.
Yeah, thanks very much, John. And even as we are undergoing this Q&A, there's still time for the audience to submit additional questions by clicking on the Q&A box in the lower left-hand corner of your screen. But here's some questions. This first one is for John. Based on the webinar, I'm concerned that my suppliers may have sites located in high-risk areas. What would you suggest I do as a first step toward identifying them?
Yeah, that's a great question. Thank you. So I think one of the things that we often help clients do is as a first step is actually do what we call a supply chain assessment. And that's if you can provide your list of suppliers, we can actually run an assessment on them to see which of them are in high-risk areas, which have sites in high-risk areas, and where the potential risks are, which is actually a very kind of, I think, a fast and easy way to start on that journey to assess risk. And then obviously the way to really proactively go after them and assess them is to take a more focused view in terms of doing supply chain mapping and turning on monitoring and seeing where the risks are and calculating risk. But we can do that. We often help clients get started very easily using that assessment technique.
Okay, thank you. Here's one for Lou. How many resources are in place to support the risk program that you have in place?
Well, that's a question that comes up often. I would say not more than, at the moment, half a dozen that are dedicated to that in managing the supply chain. On the other hand, we rely upon many in the sourcing organizations, both the direct and indirect, to actually help us implement these programs. So it's not just contained in one group that's removed from the sourcing people, but we work with the sourcing people. So it's about a half dozen, and then a focus on literally dozens and dozens and maybe hundreds of others when there's a need that we take a piece of their time.
Okay, thank you. Looks like here's another one for Lou. How do you approach being prepared for extreme weather events impacting your supply chain? Do you see this approach evolving in the future due to climate change?
The answer is yes, yes, and yes. So as you might know, that many of the suppliers are already located in places that have climatic events of typhoons and hurricanes and floods and so forth. So one thing is if you're going to continue to do business with that supplier, you need to understand the risk that you're permitting yourself to have. That's number one. Number two is the event is going to happen, whether it's the Philippines or Taiwan. So you need to have a part of a playbook that says when it does happen, what am I able to do immediately, even ahead of the event? Having protective stock, warehousing it somewhere else. Whatever those things are, there has to be a playbook that says this is what we're going to do, and one would need to take action before the event starts. And that means protecting supply, and it might also mean securing additional supply, especially because that type of thing will drive a shortage.
Yeah. Also for Lou, of course, we talked over this hour a lot about suppliers, so this is sort of arising from that. How is risk factored into the sourcing and procurement function? Specifically, is it used during supplier selection, ongoing reviews, and the like?
The answer to that is yes, and yes. So we do a risk assessment on each supplier that is onboarded. So we have a baseline of their risk. And for some reason, between the procurement, the quality, and the development team, they've decided, this is for production procurement, they've decided that they want that supplier for whatever their capabilities are. Then we do the risk associated with it. So they might be having no risk, or they might have a medium risk, or even a high risk. But once that's known, then actions need to be put in place immediately that would be ready to mitigate that risk. And then, so that's on the initial decision. But then we would use our risk tools and the results that we get from our Resilinc work to reassess if we already are doing business with a supplier that maybe is high risk, but there's some unique aspect of what they provide for us. The next question is, do you want to put your next program and next 20 part numbers with them? Maybe you do, and maybe you don't. And if you do, then what additional controls do you put in place to make sure that you can maintain supply continuity?
Okay, only a minute or so left, but this last question, which could take hours to answer, I'm going to ask both of you to just weigh in very briefly. If we kind of step back and ask, with cyber threats always increasing, how are companies addressing the risks from a supply chain, that high-level supply chain perspective? John, you want to weigh in on that quickly?
Yeah, sure. You're right. It's a longer response, but I would say, yeah, dive into it. What we're seeing is that, by avoiding it is not the answer, as Lou and both I and Lou have talked about. But I think it is one of assessment. Be able to measure and assess where your suppliers sit and be able to triage them, because there's a lot there. That would be my first comment. And Lou, I'll give you obviously the comment too.
Final word.
I think we've taken the right action. We have a team led by the Chief Information Security Officer, Legal, and Procurement to select we consider our high-risk suppliers, maybe in high-risk areas, and start to assess them through surveys and how they're handling their data. And then for those that we think are more high risk, that we do a deeper dive and maybe even on-site audits. So this is just beginning. We're going to continue to open this up, the aperture, and do this just across the board on all suppliers once we get this management system and our processes fine-tuned.
Okay, so thank you so much. We are at the end of our hour. I do want to stress that I'm sure that both of our speakers would be happy to answer any additional questions offline. Here is a slide that gives you some additional resources and contacts. But for now, I want to thank our two fantastic speakers, John Bovid of Resilinc and Lou Ferretti of IBM, for participating in this highly informative webinar today. And I want to thank our audience very much for sitting in. Everyone, have a great day.